when the Israeli regime started this genocide in Gaza, the Yemenis said, we are going to have humanitarian intervention. This is the responsibility to protect doctrine in order to stop the ongoing genocide because other countries are refusing to act. And the Yemenis said that any ships that are going to Israel, or eventually they also said that any ships from countries that are aiding Israel's genocide, we are going to intercept them and prevent them from materially supporting a genocide. They've allowed ships from other countries that are not participating in this genocide, like China, like Russia. So this idea from the U.S. that they're just attacking countries' ships in the Red Sea without any idea that it's just all just reckless, it's nonsense. It is humanitarian intervention. And this is really funny. It's actually very clever because the U.S. government has used this narrative and NATO has used this narrative for decades, claiming that they have to intervene in foreign countries because it's humanitarian intervention to stop genocide. This was, in the Biden administration, the head of USAID, and then in the Obama administration, a top State Department official was Samantha Power, who was also at the United Nations. Samantha Power, she made her entire career as the intellectual advocate for humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect doctrine. And here the Yemenis, for the first time, are actually trying to use a real humanitarian intervention, a real act of responsibility to protect, to stop an ongoing genocide, not this cynical excuse they use to try to overthrow a foreign government like NATO did in Libya in 2011. They said it was responsibility to protect based on lies. They overthrew the Libyan government, killed Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The British Parliament later published a report admitting that it was based on lies. Well, here we are. The Yemenis are taking brave actions, trying to stop this genocide, and the U.S. response is to bomb them 24/7. One other quick note on this. Now, the Yemenis, when Israel signed this so-called ceasefire brokered by the U.S., Yemen paused its operations in the Red Sea. And they said, okay, the genocide has stopped. Our operations in the Red Sea will stop. Because again, they're not just recklessly attacking countries for no reason. It was part of an attempt to stop the genocide. When Israel announced that it was reinitiating the genocidal siege on Gaza to prevent all food and medicine and aid from going into Gaza, then Yemen reinitiated these operations to try to end the siege on Gaza, the genocidal siege, which violates international law. So it's actually Yemen that has been acting in a responsible way in support of human rights, whereas we see that the U.S. and Israel are doing the opposite of supporting human rights. They're committing genocide. And of course, it's no surprise that Trump is continuing this. It was, of course, Joe Biden and the Democrats who oversaw this when it started in 2023. But it doesn't surprise me at all because when Trump was running for president, he gave speeches for pro-Israel groups. And he argued absurdly, insanely, Trump claimed that the Democrats were anti-Israel. And he famously, in his only debate with Joe Biden, when we saw that Biden's brain didn't work, in this debate, he's so crazy and so anti-Palestinian that Trump referred to Biden as a Palestinian, as an insult. Yep. And now he refers to Chuck Schumer, someone who, as a Palestinian. Chuck Schumer has never been pro-Palestinian in any way. He's only ever been pro-Israel. So, I mean, it's not surprising me at all to me at all that Trump is continuing this. But what it shows is that, the U.S. government is not a democracy. It is an empire, an imperialist authoritarian regime in which the only thing that the U.S. government can do is wage nonstop war around the world. It is not a force for peace. It is not a force for human rights, and it never has been.
Yeah, Ben. First, I'll just say before I get to the question, I believe Chuck Schumer just wrote a whole soliloquy about anti-Semitism targeting everybody who criticizes Israel. He's selling a book right now. So interesting that he's a Palestinian in Trump's eyes. It's absolutely ridiculous. But I wanted to ask you, Ben, about this particular component of Ansar Allah's humanitarian intervention, because it's exactly, I like how you put that, because they explicitly say this is an expression of them, asserting the Geneva Convention. So, Ben, the uh, Trump administration, Donald Trump himself has said, this is a permanent war, that they're doing this to stop the attacks on shipping. Yet Ansar Allah intervened in the Red Sea before the genocide resumed in Gaza because of a blockade, explicitly because of the Gaza blockade. And I wanted to ask you, though, about what your impression is about these strikes that they are launching now, because during the Biden administration, these missile strikes were actually quite troublesome. Israel now has the sirens back on every single day since the resumption of the genocide began, and U.S. Aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and elsewhere, in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, I mean, are are facing Yemeni hypersonic missiles seemingly every couple of days now. So what's your impression about this part of it? Because you mentioned the context of their resistance, but there's this element of the poorest people in the world using these incredibly advanced weapons to essentially assert the right to protect, which is supposedly the United States' number one doctrine, at least before Trump 2.0 decided to go isolationist ideologically. But for so long, this was the doctrine of the United States' empire. So what do you make of this military component of this resistance? It's quite astounding.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's amazing because it shows that the poorest country in the region is doing the most, after Iran, it's doing the most to actually support the Palestinians and to try to stop this genocide. So a few thoughts on this. First of all, let's keep in mind that Yemen is surrounded. It's the poorest country in West Asia. It's surrounded by some of the richest countries on earth that have not only done nothing to support the Palestinians, they're actually supporting Israel. So for instance, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, these are some of the world's largest oil and gas producers. They have some of the highest levels of GDP per capita on earth. They're just swimming in money. And instead of helping the Palestinians in any way, they're investing in Israel. And behind the scenes, we all know that they're supporting Israel. In fact, the UAE officially normalized relations with the Israeli regime, and Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing relations with the Israeli regime. That's why the Palestinian resistance started this operation in the first place, is because they were saying that we're on the verge of being completely abandoned. The Saudis are going to normalize relations with the Israeli regime. This was following what Trump did. I mean, this, of course, has been the U.S. plan for decades, but during Trump's first term, he passed the Abraham Accords, in which the UAE and Bahrain normalized relations with the Israeli regime. And Saudi Arabia was always the prize. That's what the U.S. wanted. The Biden administration was also trying to pressure Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel and was not successful. Although there were reports that, for instance, that the Biden administration was offering the Saudis nuclear technology, which is very funny because we hear all this propaganda demonizing Iran for having a civilian nuclear program for nuclear energy. And the U.S. and Israel says they want nuclear weapons. And in the past, they didn't want nuclear weapons. There was never any evidence of that. But now the ultimate irony is that it would be logical for them to pursue nuclear weapons, considering that the U.S. and Israel are obviously hell-bent on attacking Iran. And Trump himself just tweeted out on his website, Truth Social. He truth out, stupidest term. He truthed out a threat to Iran. So Trump is now threatening war on Iran, which he famously said that Obama was stupid for threatening Iran. Well, I guess according to Trump's logic, he's also stupid. Anyway, the point is that, there's all this propaganda about Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. was offering Saudi Arabia nuclear technology, transfer of nuclear technology, in return for normalizing relations with Israel. By the way, according to the Wall Street Journal, which reported on this, in the Biden administration, the U.S. had 3 demands for Saudi Arabia. And you can bet that the Trump administration is doing the same thing, and they probably have the same demands. Those 3 demands for Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel is that, 1, that the U.S. would provide security support and nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. 2, that Saudi Arabia must continue to sell its oil in dollars and only dollars. And 3, that Saudi Arabia must limit its its relations with China, break off all military relations with the Chinese military, between the Saudi and the Chinese militaries, and not allow China to build infrastructure in the region. According to the Wall Street Journal, those were the three conditions being negotiated. And then, of course, the Palestinian resistance started this response to Israel's genocidal blockade of Gaza, which has been going on for 15 years. And, they have, according to international law, the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance against illegal Israeli occupation. And the Israeli blockade of Gaza, going back now almost 20 years, that is considered an act of occupation according to international law. So the Palestinians had a right to armed resistance that has been reasserted in numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions. Now, in terms of how the Gulf regimes are helping Israel, I already talked about how behind the scenes they're trying to normalize, but they're also investing in Israeli settlements. This has been reported by mainstream Western media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, which has a lot of sources in Saudi Arabia. And they reported that just right after Trump's first term ended in 2021, Trump's Middle East policy advisor, West Asia policy advisor, was Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, married to his daughter, Ivanka. And like Trump, Jared Kushner is a multimillionaire real estate developer. And so Kushner, right after Trump left office, Kushner created an investment company that invests very heavily in Israeli companies. So what happened? Right after the first Trump term ended, when Jared Kushner was working very closely with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris, right after he left office, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime, which all have sovereign wealth funds where they, these are oil and gas exporters. They get paid in a lot of dollars. They have a lot of excess dollars. They don't want to convert all of those to their local currencies because it would overvalue their currency. And that would make their exports less competitive and such. And it has negative repercussions for the economy. So instead, they invest those dollars in buy up different assets. So what happened? The UAE, the Saudi regime, and Qatar, they invested billions of dollars from their sovereign wealth funds in this investment fund created by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, based in Florida. And then what did Kushner's investment firm do with that money? It invested that money in Israeli companies that profit from Israeli settlements. In other terms, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime are profiting from Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. So not only have these regimes done nothing to help the Palestinians, they are directly complicit in the colonization of Palestinian land and the genocide against the Palestinian people. This is why the late and great Palestinian revolutionary leader, intellectual, Ghassan Kanafani, famously argued that it's not just the Israeli regime and Israeli colonialism that is the enemy of the Palestinian people, but also what he referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes, in particular the Gulf monarchies that have for decades collaborated with U.S. imperialism and helped the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime try to crush all of the resistance movements in West Asia. And over decades, those resistance movements have evolved in different ways, right? So, during the first Cold War, many of these resistance movements were led by communists. Like in the Palestinian case, there was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. They still exist, but they're not the largest Palestinian armed group today. And there were similar groups in other parts of the region.